So Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh will be laid to rest today in Israel. She was killed during clashes in the occupied West Bank on Wednesday. An international probe into that tragedy has since been launched. At least that's according to some of those who are involved. For more on this, let's bring in Rolene Marks, who's with the SA Israel Policy Forum, live to us from Tel Aviv in Israel. And Rolene, it's great to have you on the program. Thank you so much indeed for making time. You know, Shireen's death has followed an all too familiar trend, hasn't it? I mean, all people can agree on is the fact that she was shot and died. What's your reaction to what's taken place?
Good morning. Well, first of all, I think the most important thing is, as you've just mentioned, a woman has been killed during a clash between the IDF and Palestinians in the town of Jenin in the West Bank. And first and foremost, we have to consider that she has been killed and that there is a family in mourning and a life that has been lost. And it is extremely, extremely regrettable any time a life is lost, and we extend our condolences to her family and loved ones.
Yeah. You know, you say this happened during clashes, and this is one of the things, for instance, that's being disputed, or rather that's being debated. You know, those who were with Shireen at the time, some of her journalist colleagues say, in fact, there weren't necessarily any clashes. The Israeli officials say they were, and in fact, they say that they suspect it was perhaps gunfire from Palestinian fighters that might have killed Shireen. These differences, how do you reckon they might affect our ability to get to the bottom of what actually happened?
There is footage to back up the claim that there were heavy clashes and there was heavy gunfire. In fact, the Palestinian coroner has actually said it's inconclusive to determine at this time who was responsible because there was a heavy exchange of gunfire. Now, we have to look at where this is taking place. This is taking place in the town of Jenin, where over the last 2 months it has become a hotspot of incitement and terror activity. And the IDF were carrying out counter-terror operations when the clashes ensued. Over the last 2 months, Israel has lost 19 lives as a result of a wave of terror attacks, and at least 3 of these attacks have been planned and have originated from Jenin. So acting on intelligence, Israeli forces were in the area to carry out raids, and they did come under heavy, heavy fire by Palestinians, and there is evidentiary support to support that. What we don't know for sure is who is responsible for the shooting of Shireen Abu Akleh. What we do assume is that it is a horrible, horrible mistake. Any time that a journalist dies in the line of fire, and it is a risk that all war correspondence carriers to be in these kind of situations, and she has regrettably and unfortunately paid with her life. But the imperative now is to determine who is responsible so that the appropriate action can be taken. But it is extremely, extremely irresponsible for many to reflexively blame Israel. We don't know the facts for sure, and this is why an investigation is absolutely paramount.
Yeah, and we'll speak about that in just a moment. Do we know how many on the Israeli side sustained any kind of injury or possibly died from these clashes where Shireen died, the clashes as you put it?
Well, what is interesting is that in the video footage, you can see from the Palestinian side the comments that we have hit a soldier. And from the IDF side, there have been no reports of any Israeli soldiers hit. So it is assumed at the moment that perhaps Shireen was mistaken for a soldier when she was hit by a bullet. From which side, we still don't know.
Do you agree that Shireen was wearing a protective vest that clearly identified her as being a member of the press?
She was wearing a protective vest that did identify her as a member of the press, but like we've seen in many wartime scenarios, we have seen press clearly identified, and unfortunately when there are heavy gun battles, some reporters have very, very regrettably been killed. We only have to look at the Ukraine at the moment, and many reporters have been killed there. Unfortunately, they're not getting the airtime and the exposure that Shireen is. And this year alone, at least 50 journalists have been killed in the line of fire. And journalists, when we go into wartime scenarios, are clearly identifiable. This is why this is not intentional. And to use terms like I've seen in the media, like assassination or execution, is extremely dangerous and irresponsible, and speaks to perhaps the prejudice of whoever is saying that, instead of looking at the situations for what they are and reporting responsibly.
Those terms are actually from the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who's actually doubled down in saying that they believe this was an execution, largely from Israel. But let me just again come to...
I just want to touch on that point, because if it was
I'll allow you to speak in just a moment. I haven't interrupted you once during our discussion. Just to get back to what you've just mentioned. So you're saying this was clashes that took place in Jenin. Yes, Shireen herself was clearly identifiable as a member of the press, but it just so happens that there were 0 casualties in Israel.
There have been casualties in Israel as a result of terror attacks, but I want to get back to President Abbas's point.
I'm asking from this particular attack.
If it was an execution, why is he refusing an investigation? Even the Americans now are insisting that he cooperates with Israel, who have asked for a joint investigation into the circumstances surrounding Shireen's death. Why is he refusing this? And terms like assassination are extremely, extremely dangerous, because all it does is it riles the anti-Israel, the anti-Jewish street, and this results in disastrous effects, like the 19 lives, 17 Israelis and 2 Ukrainian nationals inside Israel who have been murdered in a wave of terror attacks because of irresponsible and dangerous incitement.
I'm going to come back to my question, which is still largely unanswered. You believe these were clashes that took place? And it just so happens
there were clashes that took place.
And it just so happens that no one on the Israeli side was injured or hurt.
No one on the Israeli side was injured, and it is believed that this is a horrific, horrific accident, and we are awaiting the ballistics investigation for more understanding of what exactly took place. And I want to repeat that the Palestinian coroner who carried out an autopsy said it is impossible to conclude who is responsible as of yet.
Right.
This is why we need an investigation, even if it has to be a third-party investigation, to make sure that we know exactly who is responsible. But reflexively blaming Israel is extremely, extremely dangerous.
All right. Now we can come to the remarks made by President Abbas, who said that, he believes it's an execution. You've obviously pushed back against that. And part of the reason, from my understanding, that they don't want to collaborate with the Israeli authorities in this investigation is simply because they say they don't trust the Israeli government because of what they believe is the Israeli government's questionable track record in investigating things like this and in leading to any meaningful prosecution. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, Israel is a democracy. So when they say questionable, that is highly questionable. If you doubt Israel for whatever reasons, call in a third party. Israel would be open to that. We have got nothing to hide. We want the truth as much as the Palestinian Authority purports to want the truth. If you don't want to cooperate with Israel, get representatives from the European Union, from the United States, maybe a combined party, but stop refusing an investigation, because that leads our side to have questions as to why are you refusing this. Israel has a free press. It is not in our interest to clamp down on any journalist. The same cannot be said for the Palestinian Authority that summarily arrests and tortures any journalist that has any kind of criticism.
All right. Interestingly, you say that because Shireen has been known to be very critical of the Palestinian government, and some of the officials who spoke at her memorial service spoke quite highly of her. But I'm interested to find out from you, Rolene, to what extent you reckon Shireen's killing could intensify the conflict between Israel and Palestine, given everything that's been said, given the different version of events around this prominent journalist killing?
This is the worry, because when events like this happen, it understandably results in people feeling very emotive and very angry. And some people might be tempted to carry out attacks against Israelis, or even Jewish communities around the world. It is so vital how we understand and how we frame narratives surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because all too often this has a knock-on effect on Jewish communities around the world. And Israel right now wants to get back to a status where we don't have a wave of terror, where we don't have this kind of incitement. It serves neither side to have this happen, because the more terror attacks that are carried out, the more incitement that is carried out, the more Israel has to engage in counter-terror operations. And it serves no side for this. It would be better served looking at ways to cooperate with each other and move to a place of negotiation and a place of peace.